Hello and welcome back, everybody, from the break. My name is Toccarra Nicole Thomas, and I am the Director of Land Use and Development here at Smart Growth America. I hope that break was restorative for you. And if you stuck around, I hope that you learned something and could take something away from that presentation, those slides, so on formerly prosperous Black communities in towns destroyed by racial violence. Just want to flag, if you did not stick around to see it, we will share those materials afterwards. And what about that keynote? Oh my goodness, how fantastic was that? Thank you again, Dr. Bailey Bryant. And what really resonated for me from that keynote was people. It's all about the people, right? And when you're talking about equity, who is around the table when you're talking about equity? So then that's really a good context for us as we talk about our moderated panel discussion on equitable community development and community advocacy. Zoning reform, once considered an extremely wonky and dry topic, is currently having a moment on the national stage. There's more popular and media recognition of the issue and interest at the federal level from the Biden administration, which has included incentives for zoning reform and recent federal funding packages. Notable policy changes have occurred recently at both the state and city levels, and advocates are waiting to see if these changes in fact deliver more affordable housing units and advance more equitable outcomes for communities which have historically been disadvantaged by traditional zoning, which perpetuated segregation. Today, you'll hear from several leaders in zoning who can share their perspective as both practitioners and advocates. We'll hear from leaders in two communities which have recently implemented zoning reforms in an attempt to address the housing access crisis. We'll also hear from an artist whose creative visualizations have helped more community members mobilize with a better understanding of the outcomes of racist and divisive infrastructure. Please join me in welcoming Meg McMahan, Regina Celestin Williams, and Adam Paul Susaneck to today's discussion. Meg McMahan is the Director of Planning for the City of Minneapolis, where she works to leverage development and regulatory systems to drive equitable outcomes. Minneapolis is known as one of the leaders of changing their zoning to allow more housing, most notably expanding their single-family zoning to allow all types of housing. Regina Celestin Williams is the Executive Director of SV at Home, where she leads policy and advocacy for affordable housing in Silicon Valley. Adam Paul Susaneck is the founder of Segregation by Design, a project which uses data and remastered historical photography to document the destruction of communities of color in cities across the United States. Welcome, everybody. Although I've shared your brief biographical sketches, please tell us a little more about yourselves. Specifically, when did you realize that your work had an equity focus? And what was the biggest challenge you faced when advancing racial equity through your work? And I'll start with Meg with that first question.
Sure, thank you so much, Toccarra. So I'm Meg McMahan, I'm the planning director for the city of Minneapolis. I'm relatively new to the city. I've been here about 4 months, but most of my career has been in municipal planning, specifically in the Twin Cities area. And I have tended to work in communities that are either immediately adjacent to Minneapolis or nearly so. And I think most of my career embedded in communities with in more diverse communities relative to the rest of the state of Minnesota, with high rental populations. I think it's been really embedded in part of my work from the very beginning. Previous to my work in Minneapolis, most recently, I was with the city of Brooklyn Center. Brooklyn Center is a smaller suburb. It's just north of Minneapolis. It's the most diverse city in the state of Minnesota. It also has the lowest median income in Hennepin County. And the highest population of foreign-born residents. About 25% of the population is foreign-born. And working in that community for that community has been and was a really fantastic experience. And as the community development director there, I oversaw really through a transitional period quite a bit of new policy around equity and really driving community-based policy changes. And so that included a new comprehensive plan that really pivoted the city, thinking about how we want to dismantle some of the development pattern that had occurred in the 50s and 60s that created really segregated land uses. And then consequently a zoning reform that really took an equity lens. Now the work in Minneapolis has gone through a significant transition and really self-reflection over the last several years. And part of that work was really embedded within our 2040 comprehensive plan, which began in 2016, was adopted in 2021, and really dug into this look around equity as an organizing feature around which policies would be developed and established. Minneapolis is one of the most racially segregated communities in the state. And has some of the most inequitable, disparate outcomes in terms of race. And a lot of that is based on the history of the community around redlining and around racial covenants. And so part of the work that we did both in Brooklyn Center and in Minneapolis was really starting the conversation from there. And so as we engage with community and policymakers early on in the process, all of the work was really foundational in this conversation around racial equity, around historic policies and laws and practices that had occurred, so that we could really tell the story of the outcomes that we had achieved. And I think that was a way to frame the conversation and educate at the same time that helped us move this really kind of giant policy work forward. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that. So I'll just stop there and pass it on.
Thank you, Meg. Regina, same question.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me today. So I'm actually new to the space of policy and advocacy work. I've been here as the executive director of SB at Home for a little bit over a year now. And I spent significant amount of my career, over 15 years, working in affordable housing development and community development finance. And I spent time doing that work in the Mid-Atlantic, and I spent the last 7 years doing that work here in the Bay Area, where we've seen tremendous amounts of displacement, gentrification, and just increases in our unhoused populations, folks living in their cars, on the street, people having to move out of the community because of the inability to be able to afford to live here in the Bay Area. And so in our work, when I was working for an affordable housing developer, we started to seek to build more housing that could serve those who had experienced chronic homelessness, really step into the gap to prevent long-term homelessness, rapid rehousing. And as we did that, we started to see that there were sort of challenges that existed in affordable housing development, the way that the funding was structured, the confines of zoning and land use regulations that really prevented us from building enough housing on the land that was available at the premium that is available in the Bay Area. And so as I got involved in public policy advocacy from that lens of like, how can we do more? How can we build more housing? How can we serve more folks and really provide the housing that's needed, permanent supportive housing? It became very obvious that the folks who were in the policy spaces, the folks who were even in the advocacy spaces, weren't reflective of the communities that we were trying to serve. There was a real lack of diversity in the policy making spaces, and there was a real disconnect between what it took to build the housing, to buy land, to design buildings, and build the housing to serve the folks who were most vulnerable in our communities. And the folks who were setting the policy parameters, folks who were determining, what we could do within the confines of land use regulations. And so there was one particular policy, the affirmatively furthering fair housing, that was really meant to support the effort of investing in building up communities who had been traditionally marginalized and disinvested in, and recognizing the inequities because of past redlining and current zoning and land use regulations. And the way that it was being used was really to put a lot of emphasis in California on the mobility strategy, which means to build affordable housing in communities that had traditionally not invested in housing and traditionally hadn't allowed access to that affordable housing. However, that was really leaving behind the communities that had already been redlined in the past, and kind of repeating that cycle of disinvestment in urban areas. And so that was really the point where I recognized that the power of referring to the history of the practice of zoning and land use regulation, and then using that foundation to really move policy forward was critical. Without that lens, without that reframing, we were just going to repeat past harms in this space. So that's what brought me to SB at Home, and that really centers our work. You know, that really grounds our work, centering on folks who have been marginalized, those communities that continue to be disinvested in, and recognizing that as much as we can pull those folks into the conversation, that's just going to reframe this conversation and shift the narrative around the work that we need to do and what we need to accomplish.
Thank you, Regina. And now Adam, sorry.
No worries.
Same question.
Oh, yeah.
How did you
Absolutely.
know that you had equity? When did you tell us a little bit more about your background and what, how did you come to it, and the equity lens that you bring to the conversation?
Absolutely. Well, in my professional work, I am an architect, and I've mostly worked on transportation projects in New York City, in particular, excuse me, retrofitting the subway for ADA access, and in addition, designing the Sheridan Expressway, connecting the South Bronx back to Starlight Park. But that's my sort of professional work. In this realm, in the equity realm, I'm more involved in an academic capacity, I would say. For those of you not familiar, I run a project called Segregation by Design, as Toccarra mentioned, that uses historic photography to sort of demonstrate the violence of urban renewal and highway construction, and how it was targeted in particular at communities of color. I started this because I was interested, in the question of why American cities are so segregated and why they're so physically different from our international counterparts. And after studying architecture, it sort of gave me the ability to look at the built environment in a more critical fashion. I know from personal experience, anecdotally, many folks, view not necessarily us here because we're city planners and architects, but and industry professionals, but many people view the built environment as, permanent, as mountains, as if it's always been there. But this skill set sort of gave me the ability to look at it critically, and I guess I found myself, whenever walking around New York or any city, pointing things out and lecturing people on the history of why it potentially, the history of how it got that way. And I got to the point where I couldn't keep telling people to read The Power Broker, or The Color of Law is very succinct. But I couldn't keep telling people to read these big long books. So and we'll touch on this a bit later, but I wanted to use the skill set that I had developed to basically communicate these as legible and wide-reaching way as possible, for the purpose of, giving communities the context. Many of them obviously have it in their mind, in their memory, in their cultural memories, and the memories of those who lived through this. But for many people who didn't see it, it can be hard to imagine how things have changed, and how significant that change has been. So I wanted to use the skills I got to sort of make that as legible as possible, for the purpose, because the first step is understanding, is knowing the context, and the more I study this subject, there's that phrase, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And that's so incredibly true. I mean, the Cross Bronx still cuts right through the Bronx, and there's tens of thousands of people who live along it, still breathing in that particulate matter and pollution. So that's a bit of my story.
So thank you all for giving me a little bit more of your story and kind of connecting it back to Dr. Bailey Bryant's keynote, and from you all's backgrounds. What I'm hearing is people, right? And when we were preparing for this conversation, I was surprised to hear that the city of Minneapolis is considered one of the most segregated cities in the country, along with the city of San Jose, which is where you're at, Regina, and Meg, you're in the city of Minneapolis, and Adam, you're in South Florida, right? So if we can pull up the slide deck, we're going to kind of look at, on the left-hand side, you have the homeowners loan corporation maps, AKA the redlining maps. And then on the next slide, you'll see the city of San Jose. And the reason I pulled these maps out is because when we talked about it, we both kind of came to the comment that the current city zoning maps were essentially laid over these redlining maps. So basically memorializing the racist land use decisions in the built environment, right? And that these patterns still exist. So let's talk through kind of like our thoughts. What can we do to kind of, undo those effects of the history? And as Adam, you just said, the past is never past, How do we undo that when this is what the built environment is today, and our current zoning maps still reflect these redlining histories? And Adam, you came off mute, so let's start with you.
Well, I think Meg would be great at answering this, but did you want me to play the animation, or do we want to wait on that one?
Well, let's talk through it a little bit, and then afterwards we can roll into the animation.
Sure.
Sorry,
So
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I can speak to that a little bit. The visual is really great. I have a slide that I use in one of my presentations that shows the zoning and the redlining. And I think one of the things I like to remember when I feel discouraged in this work is that the built form the built form that we see out in the world today didn't occur in a few years or, a few decades even. It was over the course of, in some cases, hundreds of years of decisions. And when we think about zoning is a long game. And so one of the things we've done in Minneapolis, and I know other cities are beginning to do as well, is to really name these things that created the built form, and doing that in a really open and transparent way, right? So in Minneapolis, some of the work we've done, like I said, the 2040 comprehensive plan that really reshaped the built form in Minneapolis and will continue to into the future, just names it. It's in every page of the document, talking about how single family zoning is racist, how the city's built form was based on racist policies, right? Like, this is just named over and over again. And it's in every presentation that we give about it. And it's in every conversation that we have with community about it. We also have this really amazing project in Minneapolis that the University of Minnesota began called Mapping Prejudice. And so that started as a research project where a couple graduate students were reading through restrictive covenants, deeds, and identifying restrictive covenants, and just started to map them. And they did this over the course of years. And now it's built out into this amazing interactive website where you can go and see the pattern and spread of restrictive racial covenants. You can look up your address and see if your house has one. You can then link to your city to get tools to have that expunged from your title through the county. So there's this education piece that happens. And then you have to rewrite those rules, right? You have to get rid of that language. And in Minneapolis, what we have done through our comprehensive plan and our subsequent zoning work is to we've rezoned every parcel of property in the city. So we went from 7 residential zoning districts that again overlaid onto that redlining map really tightly, and we've eliminated that. We have 3. And they're based solely on their geographic proximity to downtown. We've gotten rid of single family zoning. And then we've looked throughout our city and we've upzoned on corridors and transit ways significantly, right? In areas that historically have not had high density housing. And we've done that equitably throughout the city. And that was really important because we have a ward system with our council members. We have 13 wards. And prior to our comprehensive plan, what would happen is those ward council members had a lot of say over projects that happened in their individual wards. And so what you had was an inequitable distribution, which I think has contributed to the segregation that we see in Minneapolis, where some wards were very welcoming to higher density and affordable housing, and others were not. And so what our comprehensive plan did was it really wiped that slate clean. And it made for a policy document, right, that we can look to. It's clear. There isn't a lot of discretion. Density is allowed by right. We eliminated minimum parking requirements. And there's probably parking is a whole separate conversation that we could have about its impacts on racial inequity. And so a lot of those things, though, are just starting. So when we start to look at like, what are the outcomes that this has produced? We may not know for another 2 decades, right? Like how this is going, because that's the nature of land use policy. But I think the work being how it's been steeped in this desire for anti-racist outcomes, and then the need to continually monitor and track that to make sure we're actually doing what we say we're doing is going to be kind of the critical tail end of that.
Yeah. So monitoring, tracking is definitely one of those, making sure that it's equitable when people are at the table when you're making these decisions. So Regina, let's come to you on the other side of the country, and kind of the same question, but I want you to drill down a little bit more on the AFFH that you mentioned, and, walk us through, that process and the big win at SV at Home, and tying it back to how the interpretation of AFFH was inequitable, and then what else can we do to continue, eliminating inequities?
Sure, I appreciate that. So at SV at Home, we're looking to build a movement. We're trying to create support and solidarity across the housing space with the goal of increasing equitable access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. And so, for us, it's really about building a broad coalition. With AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, there was a state bill that really solidified AFFH. And as the state looked to implement that work, and the goal of AFFH was really to combat discrimination that overcame patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities.
AFFH is federal or state policy. And
okay,
you're in California, right?
Yes. So Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing is actually language from the federal fair housing policy implemented by the Housing and Urban Development Department, HUD. And during the Obama administration, there was a language that strengthened this particular component of fair housing mandate, which was to affirmatively further fair housing, to take steps to make sure that, we were, combating patterns of segregation and fostering inclusive communities. The state of California, as a result, implemented its own AFFH policy. So the policy I'm referring to is state policy, but it's mandated by the federal government. And so the state took it a little bit further and broke it down specifically into these 4 actions. One is to address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity. 2, replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns. 3, transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. And 4, foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. And so you can see that's a broad range of mandate, to provide access to opportunity. That's huge. We know that there are communities that have historically denied access to resources that, wealthy white areas, especially of the state of California, that have not allowed affordable housing to be built and for low-income people to have access to those resources, whether those resources are libraries or public schools and things like that, open space. And then there's the other side of what I like to call of the AFFH coin, which is to transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. I mean, ultimately, the goal is that in this, in the state of California, in this country, you can't go from one community to the next and say, well, this is a high opportunity area and this area has no opportunity or has low opportunity. You really want equity across the state. And so for us in San Jose, we were dealing with this, this mandate, but a lot of the state policies for building affordable housing were in directing that investment and that resource of affordable housing into these higher opportunities areas. The Othering and Belonging Institute of UC Berkeley created an opportunity map that mapped the areas throughout the state that had high resources, moderate resources, and low resources. And the state tied its funding for affordable housing to this map, saying we want to fund affordable housing in high opportunity areas because there hasn't been historical access to those communities for low-income communities. And also we know research shows that social mobility for low-income folks, they can have access to that if they're in higher opportunity areas. They're more likely to have social mobility. However, in the city of San Jose, when the city was going to adopt that same policy and that same, with that same map, we said, wait a minute, we're in the city of San Jose, where there's been, historical segregation, as you mentioned. 94% of the city is zoned single family, 94%. So that leaves, high, a small portion of the area of the city that has the majority of low-income folks from marginalized communities, backgrounds, people of color, marginalized backgrounds, all in certain areas of the city. And while we want access to other areas that have high opportunity, we also want investment in our community. We are very concerned about the idea of having 100 households move to a higher opportunity area somewhere in the city of San Jose, while the rest of the thousands of people in the communities that are considered low resource don't have any investment, don't have any access to affordable housing, and are getting displaced. And so through that advocacy of working with neighborhood groups, working with the Real Coalition, which is a racial equity and leadership coalition, and working with various coalitions, anti-displacement coalitions, we were able to really adopt and push our elected officials for a policy that allowed dispersion of affordable housing throughout the city and didn't deny access to affordable housing in any parts of our city, especially new investments for affordable housing. The last thing I'll say is that we really had to be intentional about our language and intentional about how we talked about not just the history of displacement and disinvestment, but also the beauty of our city and the beauty of those ethnic and racially diverse communities, and the idea that some people feel like they are invested in their community and they want to have roots where they are, and they just need the resources, the investment to improve the quality and the conditions of their neighborhoods. So that was a lot of that discussion, and we were very happy with the policy that was adopted in December of 2022.
Thank you both, because really what I'm just hearing is intentionality, education, and giving resources back to the communities where they're at, and then tying it back to Dr. Bailey Bryant's asking the community members what they want if we're trying to dismantle these racist land use decisions. And so
absolutely,
now we're going to go back to Minneapolis, and we're going to go to Adam. Adam, you prepared a visualization of an animation of Minneapolis. Can you share your screen and walk us through what we're seeing in the process? And then we'll kind of really share your thoughts about what can we all do to ensure that lay people, residents, community members are empowered to advocate for racial justice and equity in planning for themselves. It is not just us kind of dictating it as practitioners, but we're giving them the tools to kind of advocate for themselves.
Absolutely. Give me 1 second. Sorry, Zoom makes this complicated. All right, can you see my screen there? Excellent. So this is an animation of the construction of I-35 and I-94. So planned and built in the 1960s, I-94 tore through the fabric of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Get rid of that thing down there. Sorry. All right, here we go. So I-94 tore through the fabric of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Thousands of homes and small businesses were bulldozed to make way for a massive freeway trench, creating scars that persist in the city's landscape to this day. The devastation disproportionately impacted communities of color. Despite having an only 3% non-white population by 1960, 35% of those displaced in Minneapolis were people of color. Nearly 90% of Minneapolis' total Black population lived in the neighborhoods where I-94, 35, and 55 were routed. In St. Paul, which is coming up in a moment, 6,000 people and hundreds of businesses were displaced by I-94, the majority of which were located in the Rondo neighborhood, home to 80% of St. Paul's Black residents at the time. So a bit on process, I've discussed some of this already, so apologies if it's repetitive, but I started this project basically because I was frustrated that the color of law didn't have more pictures. I trained as an architect, so I'm a very visual person, and the language of architecture theoretically is about communicating visually through drawings and images as legibly as possible, which I thought could be useful in communicating some of these historical mega projects. Without the visual aid, it can be difficult to fully grasp the scope of the change that took place, especially since so many of these images are at this point easily available online, but they can be difficult to read because of their age. It's also just to some extent difficult to compare historic black and white aerial photos to color satellite photos. So for animations like this one, I add basic colors for the purpose of comparative clarity with more modern satellite imagery. And I do the same for perspective images, which you can see on my website and my social media channels. There's animations for other cities, including Brooklyn, the Bronx, Chicago, Miami, Philly, Boston, a few others, Oakland. I haven't done San Jose yet. But
Adam, can you run it one more time? And while we're talking through, so many questions are coming up, right? Number one, like, how do you even pick your communities to spotlight? And then number two, how can we use these tools, or how can we empower community residents to advocate for themselves using these tools?
absolutely, yes. So I view my role as sort of amplifying folks like Meg and Regina, who are actually on the ground in these places, advocating for change. I'm not in each of the cities that I cover here, but the intent with something like this is to sort of meet people where they are. The goal with putting these on Instagram and social media is to just make it as easy as possible to get for people to see it, and in a format that people can understand very easily without necessarily knowing the history or the overall context. But what I view the role of animations like this is, again, potentially as a tool for people advocating on the ground for change, because I haven't spoken exactly with the folks behind or who are advocating for boulevardization of 94, which you can see here. But for instance, in Texas, in Houston, I made a series of animations that showed the footprint of an upcoming expansion. So this is not historical. This is ongoing right now. So it's a freeway expansion of I-45 in Houston that's going to displace something like 500 residents. Actually, no, 1,000 residents, 500 of whom are in a public housing facility. And I was able to coordinate with that group and get them a series of images and animations that they presented at various meetings, or at various city council meetings and TechStop public meetings. And they were able to use some of that material actually in a lawsuit they filed invoking Title 11 of the Civil Rights Act. And there is indeed a moratorium on that project right now. So I'm not saying that's because of like the work that I did, but that's because of the work that this group, Stop Texas. I think I just mentioned Ali Smither tomorrow is speaking on one of the panels. She's actually in that group, so she can speak more about this. But we coordinated, or I spoke with Ali a bunch in that organization, and was able to amplify some of their events, some of their protests, some of their organizing. I was able to use my platform to sort of help them to the extent that I could. But yeah, I guess
It sounds like just having the tools and having the information available for them was helpful in building their case, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
yeah, exactly.
Because teachers speak 1,000 words, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I prefer to just show them rather than actually talk.
And
But
so thank you so much. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I'm being a little abrupt and I apologize, Adam, but I think we got to get to some of these audience Q&A, and they are very engaged. And I'm just seeing some of the questions come in and, the comments, everyone is just blown away by the imagery, right? This one, I guess it's for everybody. Just kind of just jump in. Because land use planning is so long-term, what are interim solutions to address the urgency of the affordable housing crisis, especially for those currently experiencing homelessness? And probably let's start with you, Regina. You have any commentary on that?
Yes. It is long-term. There's been some really great wins, though, that we've had, especially around affordable housing development. And so having that long-term game plan is still really important. We've similar to Minneapolis, passed bills around streamlining affordable housing, increased density, eliminating parking, and also eliminating single family zoning. And so those things, those like ground foundational transformation moves are really important. In the interim, you know, it's really about educating our affordable housing developers. We, again, like to work in a broad coalition. And so not only pulling together residents and community members, but also affordable housing developers and practitioners, as well as lenders and everyone, and educating them all in the same room. And so really incentivizing the folks who are out there building homes into getting into the space of permanent supportive housing. We had in Santa Clara County a bond measure passed, and it was really aimed at attacking that need for permanent supportive housing, and recognizing that if we're going to build homes, we should at least be setting aside a percentage for folks who are at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. However, it was there was a learning curve. Even for folks who build homes or build affordable housing, even nonprofit partners had never really targeted their housing for folks who have been living, you know, in tents or in their cars or outside in the elements, and recognizing that if folks have, you know, severe disabilities, or if they have mental health issues, or if they have ways that they need to be able to get into like stable income like SSI, you have to be able to build in services to support that community and support their stabilization in that housing. We have a lot of folks who work who are homeless, and there's a unique, you know, experience to that, but there's also trauma that comes with that. So you have to be able to not only prevent folks from falling into homelessness so that they don't have to experience that trauma, but if you are trying to house folks who have been living unhoused and in unstable conditions, you really have to be ready to deal with that trauma and have trauma-informed care associated and attached to your housing. And so one of the things we did was really, again, with that funding, incentivize developers to join up with service providers and really get educated and push them to do more to solve the housing crisis. And we've had a lot of success with that. A lot of folks who, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, weren't providing permanent supportive housing, who now have properties, and they're coming together and sharing lessons learned so that we can do it better and produce those units quicker. So all of those solutions are adaptability is really important, especially when you're talking about industries, especially real estate development industries change slowly, but you have to have these different levers and carrots to incentivize change so that you can meet the needs of the folks who are most vulnerable.
And so now let's come, thank you for that, Regina. What stood out to me was educating and kind of giving the developers a new perspective for these equitable practices. But now let's come to you, Meg, as a practitioner, as a planning director with a long background as a planning practitioner. What do you think are some interim solutions?
Sure. So my perspective is probably more regulatory. Obviously funding, you know, I could speak, you know, in Minneapolis, our bottleneck is funding, right? So my answer would be just more money because we have projects, you know, and developers who want to build those projects and they just can't get financing because of the structure of how we finance affordable housing in this country and the limitations on that. So, you know, I could speak to that, but I won't. From a regulatory perspective, and again, you know, immediate is relative when you're in this world, right? Because our interim solutions, so number one, we adopted an inclusionary zoning policy that enacted at the same time as a lot of this other, our comprehensive plan and then our initial zoning work. So we broke our zoning work up into 2 main phases, but there's been other things we've done. So the inclusionary zoning was an immediate thing. We also deregulated, or I guess legalized, single room occupancy units. So SROs had previously been prohibited in the city. We actively altered our zoning to allow them. And then in our structure, our county is the entity that manages most of our homeless and social service and working with unhoused populations and our encampments. And so we've worked in tandem with them to convert previous hotels that had either gone out of business or were no longer functioning. The county has come in and acquired several of those. And then we've worked with them through the regulatory process to get those approved and allowed as single room occupancy to house immediately unhoused people. The city also has funding streams that support that work as well. So we really work in tandem with the county, but it doesn't necessarily live in the municipal level here. So those are just maybe 2 things that we did that really have had an immediate impact and allowed us to create a couple hundred units in a really short period of time, or, over the last 2 years. And so that's been really good, but we still are dealing with this NIMBY attitude. We have had a recent planning commission public hearing about one of these that would be located near the University of Minnesota campus in a place where there's a lot of student housing today, conversion of a hotel. And
just to clarify, NIMBY is not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, right? And so it was one of the most it was probably one of the ugliest public hearings I've sat through, and I've sat through some doozies in my career. But it's continually a difficult conversation to have. And thankfully, because we have the policy framework that we have these adopted regulations. There isn't a lot for the folks who want to fight these things to fall back on. Because there isn't a lot of discretionary decision making that's taking place by our policymakers, and that suits our policymakers just fine. They want these things to exist, but they don't want to be in a position where they have to get out in front. And so the way that we as staff can support our policymakers is really doing the due diligence on the back end and creating these really solid policies and legally binding regulations that don't leave a lot of wiggle room to kind of back out. And so for our comprehensive plan work, we did a lot of engagement on the front end and thought of that process as our public hearing, so that we could allow by right a lot of the stuff that we want to allow and take it out of the public discourse on the back end, so that these decisions, which oftentimes is where the inequity is happening, is like at the moment of decision when you have a room full of angry residents or constituents and a council person now is in this really tough position. Our goal was to we can't prevent the room full of angry people, right?
Yeah,
but what we can do is put our policymakers in a position where they have all the legal backing in the world to support the work that they want to support. And so that was kind of, I think, how we've set it up to be successful as we've seen these projects come through. And we just published our numbers. Minneapolis produced over 4,000 housing units last year, and it was something like 6 times the number of housing units that our sister city, St. Paul, produced.
Wow.
And so
I'm gonna jump in here now because we're a little bit at time.
Sure.
One more question, and this is going to be a rapid fire question for all 3 of the panelists. So you have about 30 seconds to kind of respond. How are you addressing displacement? And this is like a synthesized question from the comments. Basically, we've gotten this question a couple of times in different variations. But how are you addressing displacement occurring on account of private development that benefits from public infrastructure investments? And so rapid fire, 30 seconds. Adam, go.
I'll start. I mean, that's a really great question. We were just talking about that, Toccarra, with the New York Times for our, we're working on an article on pedestrian deaths, and it's really difficult, right? Because if you add these, the thrust of it is that, you know, pedestrian deaths are disproportionately in communities of color and low-income communities because they don't have safety infrastructure, because we disinvest in those communities. But it's a catch-22, right? Because the way we set things up is where if you invest in it, then you gentrify, right? It's like Beth was saying that we've set up this situation where affordable housing has to be like as bad as you can make it without like it being unlivable. Otherwise, you're gentrifying. I don't have an answer to the question. I'm just stating the problem because it is a significant one. And I guess I would say, and I don't know if other countries have tackled this, but I would say we looked potentially to our neighbors to see what best practices they have, because we're certainly not doing it. And then in addition to stop potentially looking at issues, so, you know, housing is also transportation, is also street safety. In order to, we have to look at those things comprehensively. Otherwise, we end up right back in the situation we are in now, where our cities are chopped up and disjointed. To the gentrification question, I have no idea. It's a really hard question, because like we can't just build more housing. I'm overgoing the. I mean, we need to build more housing, but that we need to have rent control. We need to have, it needs to be affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. But
It needs to be comprehensive, and we got to name the problem. Regina, 30 seconds on the clock.
You know, for us, it's about tenant organizing and tenant empowerment. One of the ways that we're supporting and creating staying power for residents of our communities. So one of the ways we're trying to invest in the ability for folks to do that is by through alternative ownership models. There is a lot of community land trust popping up in the Bay Area, throughout California. We have a new one in the South Bay that is working on acquiring its first property. There's a lot of interest in cooperative ownership, really giving access to low-income people to own and be rooted in their community through alternative ownership models. And then we are also exploring in various jurisdictions the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which we have in San Francisco, but we don't have in Santa Clara County, and a few communities are exploring it and really pushing for it in San Jose. It's going to come up for a decision by City Council in April. And so there's been a ton of community advocacy around how can nonprofits and community-based organizations get involved in acquiring land in their communities when they know the residents who are at risk of displacement, and working with those residents and those tenants to purchase their property and maintain affordability.
Thank you, Regina. So I'm hearing creative control, rent control, and cooperatives. Meg, 30 seconds on the clock.
Sure. I would say long-term, Minneapolis is investing in ownership. So I agree with Regina, and that is a long-term solution. As part of our ARPA funds, we allocated $40 million to a commercial development investment fund that is specifically aimed at creating BIPOC business ownership of bricks and mortar spaces in the community. And so we have heavily doubled down on commercial and business ownership, as well as home ownership. We have tens of millions of dollars invested in creating that. We have a City of Lakes Community Land Trust that we work with and through to create perpetually affordable home ownership opportunities. I think in Minnesota, we can't use eminent domain. I had seen that mentioned in the chat. So eminent domain can't be used for economic development purposes, but it can be used for transportation purposes. And I think our issue is more when the state and federal transportation and infrastructure projects come through. We see our role as being strong advocates in making sure that they incorporate funding and thinking about displacement at the early onset. So right now we have a light rail project that's planned through North Minneapolis, which is a predominantly African-American area of the city. And so we've established an anti-displacement task force that is working with that project, because we don't have a say in it, right? We're not the funders of that project. We have to just advocate and speak to the need at every opportunity and really force the engagement at that level, and ensure that there's funding in that project to help with that work. So, so yeah, I would say that's probably what we're doing.
All right, so I'm hearing there more ownership as well, and it seems like there's more city involvement in the process from that side. So I want to say thank you all, Regina, Adam, and Meg, for participating in our discussion today and giving us some really good pearls of knowledge. We're going to roll into a break. And also thank you to our attendees for all of the great questions.